Hey everyone, it's Rick Carson. We're at the beautiful Make Believe Studios, and today I want to talk about Aengus. Aengus is an interesting story. They were a studio, a console manufacturer, and a lot of people are talking about them right now because one of the most famous Aengus consoles has just moved all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. So Aengus, as I know the story, started out in the early 70s, and how it originally started was there was a guy named Bill Reisman, and Bill Reisman was an engineer who was working with an artist, and they purchased one of the last API consoles that was ever produced by the original API. So this console supposedly wasn't complete. It was just a pile of input modules, and there needed to be a frame, a center section figured out, a patch bay, and I believe they had some center section parts, but some stuff definitely needed to be made. And they got in touch with a guy who I have been told was named Vinny or Vincent, something like that. But he was an employee of API, and he came and he helped them assemble this console. And from there, they decided, hey, why don't we build another console, and let's go ahead and put that in a studio that we make our own studio. And that is kind of where the genesis for Aengus was born. And they found a beautiful building in Massachusetts, and upstairs was the studio and downstairs was the console. And this studio was used by a lot of cool people. I believe the Cars worked in there at some point, but it was generally a pretty hip place with young people who were doing cool things from the stories that I've heard. And the people who were in the building were, you know, that guy Vin and Bill Reisman and a really talented engineer named Steve Crump. Also, there was another really talented engineer named Michael Blackmere, the son of David Blackmere of DBX fame, and Michael was responsible for designing all of the frames and the metalwork of these consoles. And there was a dude named Jesse Henderson, who I actually had the chance to befriend, who was just a very, very talented engineer. And these consoles started going further than just Aengus Studios. One made its way over to Longview Farms, and that was probably one of the more famous Aengus consoles. This console lived in their B room after they upgraded it, and they continued to use it, and it was a beautiful console. And this console was a lot like the console that I ended up acquiring. The console that I ended up acquiring, as far as I could trace it back, I believe it was an Aengus 1608 that was made originally for a remote truck that James Taylor had commissioned, but that console eventually made its way to New York City, where it was owned by a very talented engineer named Bobby Cadway. And Bobby used that console with a good friend of mine who was a young engineer at the time, Roy Henderson. And Roy Henderson had actually gone through and made replacement amplifiers for this console called Cadway cards. And I have a photo of that here so you can check it out. But that leads us to the most famous Aengus console. So the most famous Aengus console was the one that actually just got sold. And that console originally started its life for a studio called Indigo Ranch in Malibu. And Indigo Ranch was originally started by one of the founding members of the Moody Blues, and it was sold to a man named Richard Kaplan. And there were a lot of cool records done at Indigo Ranch, and a lot of cool producers worked out of there. Ross Robinson worked out of there. A lot of the early new metal records, Korn and Slipknot, a lot of cool stuff was done at Indigo Ranch. And I love the sounds of the records that were made there. So that's where I got onto the whole Aengus journey. But it gets a little bit more interesting because Richard, while clearly being a guy who could use his ears, was also a tinkerer. And there was a very talented man named Dean Jensen who was a tech, and he also owned a transformer company called Jensen Transformers. And Richard would hire Dean as a freelance tech to come in and work on the consoles and modify them. And they replaced what was known as the Aengus pop amp, the original Aengus amplifier, with Jensen 918s. And they replaced the UTC input transformers and the Aengus output transformers with, Jensen transformers. And they also increased the capacitors on the power rails, sometimes 10x to make the desk just more beefy. And I love going through Aengus stuff because you can see what was once owned by Richard and what wasn't. If it has a 918 in it, it was probably owned by Richard. And he had 4 Aengus consoles from what I can find. Most of Richard's stuff went to David Lyons or another gear broker. So it's been sold, and that's where Mark out in Wisconsin comes in. He was the person who bought the original Aengus from Indigo Ranch. And unfortunately, when Mark bought it, it didn't have any of its equalizers left. And he, populated it with API equalizers and fully restored the console. And it was just absolutely beautiful. But that leads us into the next conversation, which is the equalizer. The Aengus 404 or 101, depending on exactly how you look at the graphics of these things, was a graphic equalizer. And that was actually a pretty novel idea. For the 500 series, the Aengus was actually the first graphic equalizer. It came before the 560. And Steve Crump was the person who designed the Aengus equalizer, from my understanding, with the input from Bill Reisman. But Steve was the driving powerhouse behind it. And it's interesting as far as how this goes, because when API decided to go back into business, making consoles again a few years later, I think it was 74, 75, sometime around then, they actually decided that they needed a graphic equalizer. And they had a equalizer called the 559 that they would sell on the market through a company called Apsy. And that was actually Steve Crump who designed those equalizers. And he went on to form another audio company, which is, the name is slipping my brain right now, but I'll find it and post up a photo of it, and continued to make what I would consider budget-friendly consoles. Nothing really at the level of what I think the Aengus was. Even the APS-I EQ wasn't exactly what I would consider an Aengus EQ as far as sound goes. The Aengus EQs really are legendary, and there's a lot of people who love them very, very much, including Sylvia Massey and Ross Hogarth and the people who made records with Ross Robinson. I know there's some people who have even beat down my door trying to figure out how to get their hands on some Aengus equalizers. And I think that it's really cool that these things have continued to go throughout time. And even back then, the equalizer really made some waves. This is one of the things that on my journey I found, very interesting, which is there was a studio out in the UK called Strawberry Sound, and they would build their own consoles. These consoles were typically made by Helios, but they also had their own in-house console company called Formula Sound, and they would make their own consoles as well. And what's really cool about these consoles, they're big, wraparound, beautiful desks, but in the little wings of the desks, you would see that there would be third-party outboard gear. There would be gates and compressors and stuff, but almost every single one of these consoles had two Aengus equalizers in it. And I think that that's very, very cool. So when API decided to go back into business, they decided that they needed a graphic equalizer, and they sold the Apsy EQ. But after that, they said, we need to design our own. And they actually reached out to someone who was famous for designing a graphic EQ, a guy named Al Davies, who had originally designed the Altec Lansing and the Longevin graphic EQs that have become very, very famous. He actually came in for API, and the story goes that he designed not only the API 560, but also the other equalizers that feature an IC differential input like the API 554 and stuff like that. So I just love that this small little company that, as far as I know, produced somewhere around 20 consoles, maybe 30 consoles, and existed for 4 years, really had such an impact that lasts even to this day. And it's really awesome for me to have dived so deep into this that there are people who reach out to me and want to talk about Aengus stuff, which I just absolutely love. And one of those people was a good friend of mine named Patrick, who actually owns one of the last Aengus consoles that was ever made, that features a completely different equalizer design that has one band that's parametric and 4 bands that are graphic. And he was just so gracious enough to send me over a couple of these equalizers, and I absolutely cherish them. So thank you guys so much for checking this out. If you guys have had a chance to use some Aengus stuff, I'm very curious on what you guys think of it. To me, I think it sounds better than API stuff. And the console that I had was actually not modified by Dean. It was full of Aengus parts. And sure, it broke up in a way that, probably was less high headroom than an API, but it just sounded so incredibly rock and roll and musical. Catch up with it. Bye.